The film begins with a guy named Edward who is a businessman. At that time, he tries to take his girlfriend with him on a business trip, but she says no because she thinks he doesn't love her. She even breaks up with him because she's been talking to his secretary a lot. After the breakup, Edward has to borrow a fancy car from his lawyer Phil because his own fancy car is stuck. Phil is really worried because he just bought the car, and Edward isn't very good at driving. On the same night, there's a scene in a bar where a woman named Vivian confronts her friend Kit. Kit spent all their rent money on parties and drugs. Kit tells Vivian that the apartment is actually hers, and she only lets Vivian stay there. She also reminds Vivian that she gave her a job and a place to live when Vivian had nothing. There, Vivian finally opens up to Kit and tells her about finding a murdered prostitute. She wants to leave their life as prostitutes and start fresh. Meanwhile, Edward gets lost and ends up in the red light district of Hollywood Boulevard while trying to go back to his hotel in Beverly Hills. After getting lost, Edward asked a homeless person for directions, but the beggar thought he was joking because he wanted to find Beverly Hills, which is a fancy place where rich people live. Then, a woman named Vivian thought Edward needed a date and tried to make him interested in her. Edward agreed to pay her to help him because he didn't want to waste any more time. While they were driving to Beverly Hills, Vivian noticed that Edward wasn't great at driving and seemed to know a lot about sports cars. So, Edward let Vivian drive, and they talked about her job. Vivian said she made $100 an hour, which Edward found expensive. He was surprised because she didn't look rich with her cheap clothes and boots. They finally got to the hotel, and Vivian planned to leave because Edward only paid her to show him the way. But to her surprise, he asked her to stay with him at the hotel, and she agreed. At that time, Vivian wore revealing clothes, and when they entered the hotel, people looked at her strangely. Instead of getting upset, Vivian flirted with Edward in front of everyone to annoy them. Soon after, Edward took Vivian to his room and told her he was afraid of heights, even though he always stayed in the top-floor penthouse. Then Vivian offered him something, thinking he wanted to do the unthinkable, but Edward declined and just wanted to chat. After arriving at the hotel, Edward offered Vivian some champagne and strawberries and asked how much she would charge to stay the night. Vivian thought he might find her rates too high, but Edward confidently said he had a lot of money. When Vivian mentioned her price for the night, Edward agreed without hesitation, and they decided to spend the night together. In a romantic setting, Vivian tried to be very seductive, and eventually, they became intimate. The next day, Edward received a call from his lawyer, Phil, who informed him that the owner of Morse Industries didn't want to sell the company to Edward. In response, Edward told Phil to set up a dinner meeting with the owner and planned to invite Vivian along. Edward then asked Vivian to join him on a week-long business trip and offered to pay her $3,000. Vivian agreed to go with Edward on the business trip. Before leaving for work, he told her to buy suitable clothes for a fancy dinner at a luxurious restaurant. Shortly after, Vivian called Kit to let her know about the trip and mentioned the $3,000 payment, which surprised Kit. Soon after, Vivian went to a high-end clothing store, but the staff looked down on her because of her appearance and assumed she couldn't afford their expensive clothes. Annoyed, she returned to the hotel and shared her frustration with the hotel manager, Barney. Barney, empathizing with Vivian, contacted a friend who could help her get the right clothes for the fancy dinner. With the kind help of an elderly lady, Vivian was able to find suitable clothes, and she thanked Barney for his assistance. Barney also took the time to teach Vivian about proper dining manners and explained the various utensils typically used in fancy restaurants. In the evening, Edward arrived at the hotel to pick up Vivian, and he was captivated by her elegant appearance. When they got to the restaurant, he introduced Vivian to James, the owner of Morse Industries, and his grandson, David. Even though Vivian had learned about dining etiquette, she didn't expect that they would order escargot for dinner, which made it a bit challenging for her to use the special tongs. However, James and David were friendly and polite, not making a big deal out of it. During the dinner, James and David rejected Edward's proposal to buy their company and mentioned Edward's father. There, Edward sadly revealed that his father had passed away just last month. Before leaving, James warned Edward that he would take drastic measures to protect his company if Edward continued to pursue the purchase of Morse Industries. After their dinner, Edward and Vivian went back to the hotel and had a casual chat. During their conversation, he opened up to Vivian about his distant relationship with his late father and shared that he wasn't with his dad when he passed away. Upon hearing that, Vivian tried to comfort Edward, who seemed upset because his business meeting didn't go well, but he asked her to rest while he went downstairs. At night, Vivian had trouble sleeping and noticed that Edward had been gone for a while. Curious, she decided to follow him. When she got downstairs, she found Edward playing the piano to calm himself. Seeing that, Vivian complimented his piano skills, but Edward asked the hotel staff to leave so he could be alone with her. They had a romantic and intimate evening together. The next day, Edward took Vivian to a fancy clothing store for some shopping. He gave her his credit card and told the store manager to treat her like a VIP because she would be buying a lot of clothes and other items. After buying many clothes, Vivian went to another store where the employees had previously looked down on her. She wanted to show them that she had a lot of money and prove them wrong. Meanwhile, Phil started noticing some strange changes in Edward's behavior. At that time, Edward seemed distracted, as if something more important than their main goal of acquiring Morse Industries was on his mind. A few days later, Edward took Vivian to watch a polo match and introduced her to Phil and his wife. Phil was friendly to Vivian, but he secretly had suspicions about her, especially when he saw how happy Edward was when she was around. Later on, David, who was playing in the polo match, approached Vivian and invited her to see his horse. Meanwhile, Phil, who was still suspicious of Vivian, asked Edward about her background and job. At first, Edward didn't want to go into detail, but when Phil mentioned that Vivian was talking to David and accused her of being a spy, Edward finally admitted that Vivian was a prostitute. While Edward was busy in a business discussion with the senator, Phil tried to make advances toward Vivian and revealed that Edward had told him about her being a prostitute. This upset Vivian, and she was disappointed that Edward had revealed her true identity to Phil. When they got back to the hotel, Vivian and Edward had a heated argument. Vivian, who was already disappointed with Edward, chose to leave him, even though he apologized and offered her the money he promised. There, Edward tried to give her the money, but Vivian refused and left. Realizing his mistake, he chased after her and tried to convince her to stay. Eventually, Vivian agreed to reconcile with him, and they patched things up. The next day, Edward intentionally canceled his business meeting because he wanted to spend time dating Vivian. Later on, Edward was captivated by Vivian's beauty when she dressed in a stunning red dress. He surprised her with a necklace, gently placing it around her neck. When Vivian asked where they were headed, Edward told her it was a secret to make it more exciting. This made her even more curious. To her surprise, they'd boarded a private jet and flew to San Francisco, which thrilled Vivian because she had never been on a plane before. Once in San Francisco, Edward took Vivian to see an opera, something she had never experienced before. In the days that followed, they grew closer, enjoying picnics in the park and dining at restaurants. However, as the end of the week approached, Edward reminded Vivian that their business arrangement would conclude. He had arranged an apartment for her and offered her financial support, so she wouldn't have to work as a prostitute on Hollywood Boulevard anymore. But Vivian felt offended by the offer, thinking Edward was treating her like a prostitute again. Vivian then shared a bit about her childhood, explaining how her mother used to lock her in the attic as punishment. Back then, she used to imagine herself as a princess trapped in a tower, hoping a knight in shining armor would come to rescue her. There she thanked Edward for wanting to help her, but firmly declined his offer. Soon after, Kit visited Vivian at the hotel and quickly realized that Vivian had fallen in love with Edward because she seemed sad about having to part ways with him. However, Vivian denied it and insisted that she liked Edward because he treated her kindly. Meanwhile, Edward was in a business meeting with James and David, but surprised everyone by changing his mind about buying Morse Industries. Instead, he decided to help James protect his company. James was happy about this unexpected turn of events, but wondered why Edward had changed his plan. Edward didn't provide a detailed explanation, only asking James to trust him. However, Edward's decision didn't sit well with Phil because they wouldn't make any money from helping James keep his company. At that time, Phil planned to visit Edward at the hotel to demand an explanation, but found Vivian packing her things instead. Annoyed, Phil blamed Vivian for the changes in Edward, especially his decision to assist Morse Industries, which wouldn't benefit them financially. Knowing Vivian's background as a prostitute, Phil started to touch her inappropriately, wanting to harm her. In that moment, Vivian tried to resist, and luckily, Edward arrived just in time to rescue her. There, Edward confronted Phil and threw him out. But Phil still insisted that Vivian deserved mistreatment because she was a prostitute. Edward, furious at Phil's behavior, decided to fire him. Afterward, Edward gave Vivian the money they had agreed upon, and she accepted it. But when Edward asked her to stay for one more day, Vivian kindly declined because she had already decided to leave. There, she met with Barney to say her goodbyes and expressed her gratitude for his help, even though he knew she was a prostitute. Barney arranged a driver to take Vivian home in a fancy limousine. In the following days, Vivian packed her things because she planned to move to San Francisco to find a better job and continue her education. She tried to convince Kit to come along, but Kit refused, and they shared a heartfelt hug as they knew they would soon be apart. Meanwhile, Edward approached Barney and asked him to return a set of jewelry to the jewelry store. When Barney saw the jewelry, he realized it was the same jewelry that Vivian wore on their date. Barney could tell that Vivian refused the jewelry because Edward seemed sad. Realizing that Edward might have fallen in love with Vivian, Barney informed him that the driver who would take him to the airport was the same person who had driven Vivian home. Shortly after, as Vivian was about to leave, she heard a car horn and saw Edward in a white limousine. Edward referred to himself as a knight on a white horse rescuing the princess trapped in the tower. Despite his fear of heights, he climbed the stairs to express his love for Vivian. At that moment, Vivian was overjoyed because Edward had made her childhood dream come true, and they shared a loving kiss. The film ends. The moral lesson from this film is never underestimate a knight in shining armor who's afraid of heights, because he might just sweep you off your feet in a fancy car and a private jet to make your childhood dreams come true.